What would you do if you were unjustly accused and targeted by a corrupt system, only to find an unexpected ally ready to fight alongside you? In this powerful story, Grace Williams, a black woman and the chief of internal affairs, faces blatant racial profiling by a racist officer. As she digs deeper, she uncovers a vast network of corruption and cover-ups led by high-ranking officials. With the help of her trusted colleague Sophia Martinez, Grace turns the tables, exposing the lies and holding those responsible accountable. Get ready for a story that challenges systemic corruption, reinforces the importance of truth and justice, and reminds us of the power of standing up against deeply entrenched injustice. Subscribe to Mr. Denzel Stories for more impactful narratives like this. Don't forget to like, comment, and share. Peter Rogers, a police officer with a reputation for arrogance and an unsettling demeanor, stood by his patrol car. His posture was rigid, his hand hovering near the holstered gun at his hip. The evening air was crisp, and the headlights from his vehicle illuminated the road as he signaled for a sleek, black SUV to pull over. "Step out of the car immediately, ma'am," Peter barked, his tone sharp and commanding as he attempted to assert his authority. Inside the car, Grace Williams sat calmly. Her petite frame was composed, her hands resting on the steering wheel. Her neatly tied-back hair and professional attire reflected her polished demeanor. She made no move to comply with Peter's demand. "And why should I do that?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. Her unwavering tone carried no hint of intimidation. Peter's eyes narrowed as he stared at her, suspicion evident in his expression. "The license and registration don't match this vehicle," he declared. "This car looks too nice to belong to you. It seems stolen." Grace sighed softly, her gaze never faltering. Slowly, she reached into her blazer pocket and retrieved her wallet. Her movements were deliberate but unthreatening. Pulling out a gleaming badge, she held it up for Peter to see. "I think you should be careful with your tone," she said. Her voice carried an icy authority. "I'm Grace Williams, Chief of Internal Affairs, and you, Officer Rogers, are making a very serious mistake." The color drained from Peter's face. His hand trembled slightly as he took a cautious step back, his earlier confidence vanishing. "Wait, who are you?" he stammered, his voice faltering. Grace's eyes were locked on his, cold and resolute. "You just racially profiled me, didn't you?" she said. Her words were a sharp accusation, cutting through the tense air like a blade. Before Peter could respond, the screech of tires announced the arrival of another police car. Sergeant Mark Sullivan stepped out, his expression stern but controlled. A seasoned officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, Mark immediately recognized Grace. "Chief Williams," he greeted, his voice steady as he attempted to mask his unease. "What's going on here?" Grace turned her head slightly, acknowledging Mark without breaking her intense gaze on Peter. "Your officer here assumed I wasn't worthy of driving this car," she said coldly. "He thinks it's stolen because the driver happens to be me." Mark's brow furrowed briefly before his composure returned. He turned to Peter, his voice firm but measured. "That's enough, Rogers. Get back in your car." Peter hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he wanted to object. However, the weight of Mark's command made him lower his head and retreat without a word. Mark turned back to Grace, his tone apologetic. "I'm sorry about this, Chief Williams. I'll handle the matter immediately." Grace crossed her arms, her expression stern and unyielding. "You'd better, Sergeant Sullivan," she said. "And don't think for a second that I'll let this slide." With that, Grace stepped back into her car and drove away, leaving Mark standing by the roadside. He exhaled a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly as he watched her taillights fade into the distance. As the teenagers stood frozen under Officer Peter Rogers' menacing gaze, one of them, a tall boy in a red hoodie, spoke up, his voice steady but laced with caution. "We're just playing basketball. We're not doing anything wrong." Peter's eyes darted to a small speaker nearby. "What about that speaker?" he barked, blasting music and disturbing the peace. "You're harassing people." "No one's complained," the boy protested, his tone firm but respectful. Peter took a step closer, his hand hovering near his belt. "Don't talk back. Do you want me to arrest you for obstructing an officer?" "Peter," Stop this right now. Grace Williams' voice rang out, calm yet commanding. Peter spun around, his face paling as he saw Grace approaching. His initial confidence faltered as he attempted to recover. "What are you doing here?" he snapped, his tone defensive. "The question is, what are you doing?" Grace countered, stopping just a few feet from him. Her voice was sharp and unyielding. "Another group of kids of color? Another baseless accusation? How long do you plan to keep this up?" Peter bristled, attempting to regain his authority. "This isn't your business. I'm just handling a disturbance." Grace raised an eyebrow, pulling out her badge and holding it up. "Since when is playing basketball a crime? All I see is a group of kids having fun, and I don't see anyone complaining, except you." Peter pointed at the boy in the red hoodie. That one was blasting music and being disrespectful. Grace turned to the boy. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Marcus," he replied, his voice cautious as he glanced at Peter. "Marcus, did you do anything wrong?" Grace asked. Marcus shook his head. "We were just playing basketball." He came over and started yelling. Grace looked at the other teenagers. "Is that true?" They all nodded, their voices overlapping as they confirmed Marcus' account. "Yes, that's what happened." Grace turned back to Peter, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Well, Peter, any witnesses? Any complaints?" Peter shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting around as if searching for an escape. "Maybe the complainant left," he muttered weakly. "How convenient," Grace said dryly. "No witnesses, no evidence, and yet you're ready to intimidate children. Is this how you do your job?" Peter's jaw tightened, his face flushing with anger and humiliation. "I'm just doing my job." Grace ignored his excuse and turned back to the teenagers. "You're all fine. Go back to your game. Nobody's going to bother you." The teens hesitated, then mumbled their thanks before retreating to the basketball court. They glanced over their shoulders as they picked up their ball and resumed their game. Grace stepped closer to Peter, her voice dropping to a low whisper. "I warned you. You're not just being investigated. You're digging your own grave." Peter glared at her, his fists clenching at his sides. "You'll regret this, Grace." Grace held his gaze, her tone unwavering. "Try me. I'm ready." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Peter rooted to the spot, his face dark with barely contained fury. Behind his simmering anger, a vengeful plan began to take shape. Grace read the message in silence, the weight of its threat settling over her like a shroud. The attack on Nathan wasn't just a warning, it was an escalation. She paced her living room, her mind racing as she replayed every interaction, every lead she'd pursued. They were trying to break her resolve, using fear to push her out of their way. But fear wasn't going to win. The next morning, she met Sophia at the office. They worked quietly, poring over evidence, connecting dots, and planning their next move. Nathan's attack had lit a fire under Grace, sharpening her focus. Sophia could see it in her eyes, the determination that refused to waver despite the risks. They had traced the threats and the messages, each one leading closer to Mark Sullivan and Peter Rogers. The forged emails had been crafted with precision, designed to incriminate Grace, but Sophia's expertise had uncovered their origin. Every piece of evidence pointed back to the same source. Later that evening, Grace sat in her office, surrounded by files and documents. The faint hum of the city outside was a reminder of the world moving forward while she fought to protect it from the rot within. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Sophia, her face a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. She held a USB drive in her hand. "It's all here," Sophia said, placing it on Grace's desk. "The messages, the financial transactions, the recordings. Everything we need to bring them down." Grace picked up the drive, turning it over in her fingers. It was a small thing, but it held the power to unravel years of corruption. She nodded at Sophia, her voice steady as she said, "Let's finish this." Sophia smiled faintly, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "Just be ready, Grace. They won't go quietly." Grace knew Sophia was right. Mark and Peter were cornered animals now, and cornered animals were dangerous. But she wasn't afraid. She had come too far to back down. The following day, Grace presented the evidence to the department head. The room was silent as she laid out her case, the weight of her words and the clarity of her proof leaving no room for doubt. The department head's expression hardened as he reviewed the documents and listened to the recordings. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with authority. "This ends today." By evening, Mark Sullivan and Peter Rogers were taken into custody. The arrests were swift and decisive, the culmination of years of unchecked corruption brought to light in a single, powerful moment. The media caught wind of the story almost immediately, and headlines flashed across screens and newspapers. Grace stood outside the courthouse, her face calm but her mind racing. The fight wasn't over, but this was a victory she wouldn't take for granted. At the hospital, Nathan was watching the news from his bed. His face lit up as he saw the images of Mark and Peter being led away in handcuffs. Grace entered the room, and he greeted her with a tired but genuine smile. "You did it, sis," Nathan said, his voice filled with pride. "You really did it." Grace sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "We did it. I couldn't have done this without you." Nathan chuckled softly. "I just got beat up. You're the one who took them down." Grace smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting both relief and determination. "This is just the beginning, Nathan. There's so much more to fix, but I won't stop. Not until every last piece of this corrupt system is gone." Nathan squeezed her hand gently, his voice steady despite the weight of their journey. "I know you won't, and I'll be right here, cheering you on." The two sat in silence, the glow of the television casting soft shadows on the walls. The road ahead was long, but Grace was ready for it. She had faced the worst they could throw at her, and she was still standing. Nothing could stop her now. Grace stood tall despite the officers surrounding her, her eyes scanning the scene with an icy calmness that belied the storm within. She knew the setup was obvious: a bag of cash, a convenient witness, and Peter Rogers leading the charge. It was a desperate move, and their arrogance would be their downfall. From the shadows of the warehouse entrance, a faint sound echoed, a car door closing, followed by steady footsteps. The officers, caught up in their fabricated scene, didn't notice. Grace did. She turned her head slightly toward the sound as Sophia Martinez stepped into view, flanked by two senior internal affairs officers and a representative from the district attorney's office. Peter's smirk faded instantly. His confident stance wavered as the weight of the situation shifted. "What's going on here?" he barked, his tone sharp with panic. Sophia stepped forward, a small recording device in hand. "Funny you should ask, Officer Rogers. We were about to ask you the same thing." She gestured to the officers behind her. "Everyone, stand down. This operation is no longer under your jurisdiction." Peter's face turned pale. "What are you talking about?" he snapped. "This is a legitimate arrest." Sophia's smile was razor-sharp. "Legitimate? Let's see what the DA thinks." She held up the recording device and played back a conversation between Mark Sullivan and Peter, their voices unmistakable. Peter's words from the recording filled the warehouse. "We plant the money, make the witness say she took it, and it's game over for Grace. She won't be able to crawl out of this one." The silence that followed was deafening. The officers surrounding Grace exchanged uneasy glances, stepping back from her as the gravity of the situation sank in. Grace's voice broke the tension. "Seems like your game is over, Peter." "Not mine." Peter's hand twitched toward his holstered weapon, but one of the senior officers stepped forward. "Don't even think about it," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. At that moment, Mark Sullivan, who had been watching from a discreet distance, emerged from the shadows, his face twisted with anger and panic. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You have no proof that I was involved." Sophia didn't flinch. She gestured to another officer, who handed her a file. "Proof? You mean this?" She opened the file, displaying documents linking Mark to the fabrication, including financial transactions, coerced witness testimonies, and falsified reports. "We traced every move, every lie. You've been sloppy, Mark, and now it's all here." Mark's shoulders slumped, and his once commanding voice turned to pleading. "You don't understand. I was forced into this. I had no choice." Grace's gaze was steady, unyielding. "There's always a choice, Mark. You chose power over integrity, and now you'll face the consequences." Peter, still defiant, glared at Sophia. You think this will stick? You've got nothing solid. Sophia tilted her head. We've got enough to put both of you away for years. And just in case you're wondering, this entire setup tonight? It's been monitored and recorded by a live team. You walked yourselves right into it. As the realization hit, Mark and Peter were cuffed by the senior officers. The DA's representative stepped forward, addressing the remaining officers in the warehouse. Let this be a lesson. Corruption has no place in this department. This is the beginning of a complete overhaul. Grace, finally free of the trap, exhaled deeply. She looked at Sophia and gave her a nod of gratitude. Outside the warehouse, as the media swarmed to capture the arrests of Mark Sullivan and Peter Rogers, Grace stood on the steps, her presence commanding. Reporters shouted questions, their cameras focused on her. She raised a hand to quiet them. The truth has a way of coming to light, Grace said, her voice clear and strong. Today, justice was served not just for me, but for everyone who has been silenced by corruption. This is just the beginning. We will rebuild trust and integrity in this department, one step at a time. The crowd erupted in applause, the weight of the moment palpable. Sophia stepped beside Grace, whispering, "You did it." Grace looked at her with a faint smile. "We did it. Together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the city lights flickered on, and Grace stood tall, knowing the battle was far from over, but confident in her resolve to see it through to the end. Grace returned home that night, carrying the weight of recent victories and ongoing battles on her shoulders. The dim light of her living room cast long shadows, and a quiet stillness filled the air. She placed her briefcase on the table, her eyes briefly closing as she tried to shake off the exhaustion that had seeped into her bones. She moved to the kitchen, intent on making herself a cup of tea, but something on the table caught her eye, a white envelope. The envelope was plain, with no markings save for her name, Grace Williams, scrawled in uneven handwriting. A chill ran down her spine as she realized she hadn't left it there. Every door and window in her home had been securely locked. Grace picked up the envelope carefully, her fingers brushing over the rough paper. With deliberate precision, she opened it, revealing a single piece of paper inside. The note was short and chilling. "Don't think it's over. We're still here, and we won't forget." Grace felt a surge of unease, but it was quickly overpowered by the fire of her resolve. She scanned the room once more, her sharp eyes ensuring there was no immediate danger. While the note unsettled her, it also solidified a truth she already knew. This fight wasn't over. The corrupt system she had begun dismantling still had tendrils lurking in the shadows. The next morning, Sophia arrived at Grace's house, her concern evident. Grace showed her the note, watching as Sophia's expression darkened. "They're trying to scare you," Sophia said firmly, placing the note on the table. "But this proves something else. We hit them where it hurts." Grace nodded, her expression resolute. "They're angry because they know their power is slipping. They think fear will make me stop." "They're wrong," Sophia replied. "But we need to be vigilant. They're clearly willing to go further than we thought." Grace sighed, crossing her arms. "We've exposed Mark Sullivan, Peter Rogers, and Richard Davenport, but we both know this network runs deeper. Davenport wasn't working alone. There are more players, higher up the chain." Sophia gave her a knowing look. "We've come too far to back down now. If they're still hiding in the shadows, we'll find them." Grace met her gaze, seeing the unshakable determination in Sophia's eyes. "You've given everything to this fight, Sophia, but I know this isn't just about the job for you." Sophia offered a faint smile. "You're right. This is personal. I'm fighting for my father's honor, for the victims who never got justice, for those whose voices were silenced. I won't stop, even if it makes me a target." "You're not alone in this fight," Grace said firmly. "We won't let them control everything. Not anymore." Later that evening, Grace sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of files and records. Each file contained a complaint, a story, or a plea for justice. These were voices that had been ignored, buried, or dismissed. Grace knew her recent victories were only a small piece of the larger battle. She turned to Sophia, who was meticulously analyzing additional data, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her laptop. "This isn't just about exposing a few individuals," Grace said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about uprooting an entire system. If we stop now, everything will return to the way it was." Sophia looked up, her expression resolute. "Then we don't stop. We keep going, no matter what." That evening, Grace drafted a letter to her team. She thanked them for their unwavering support and reminded them of the road ahead. "We've proven that truth can prevail," she wrote. "But this isn't the end. There are still countless injustices that need to be addressed. Be ready, because the road ahead will be long and challenging." Standing by her window, Grace looked out at the city bathed in golden light. A quiet determination filled her. She had done the right thing, but the journey was far from over. The system she was fighting against was deeply rooted and resilient, but she believed in the power of persistence, truth, and justice. "They may hide in the shadows," she murmured to herself, her gaze fixed on the horizon, "but I won't let them stay there. The light always finds a way." As the night deepened, Grace prepared herself for the battles yet to come. Her fight had become more than a mission for justice. It was now a symbol of hope for those who had been silenced. Though the challenges were immense, she knew she would continue to push forward, shining a light into the darkest corners of corruption and injustice.